I always believed my marriage was strong, but I still felt something missing inside me every day. I looked at Victoria Blake and told myself I was lucky. She was a CEO, always busy, always shining. I was just her husband standing in the shadow. Victoria said, "Ethan, why are you staring like that again?" I forced a smile and said, "Just thinking about us." She laughed softly. "You think too much. I am fine, you are fine. Everything is fine." But I was not fine. I felt alone even when she was sitting beside me. That evening I cooked dinner and waited for her. The house was silent. My phone stayed quiet. I said to myself, "She will come soon. She is just busy." When she finally came, it was late. She removed her heels and sighed. Victoria said, "Sorry, Ethan. Work is killing me." I replied, "You always say that." She looked at me and said, "Do you not trust me?" I shook my head quickly. "No, I trust you." She smiled and kissed my cheek lightly. "Good. Because I am doing this for us." I wanted to believe her. Then her phone rang. The name on the screen was Daniel Scott. Her expression changed instantly. Her voice turned softer. "Yes, Daniel. I saw the report. I noticed it, but I stayed quiet." After the call, I asked, "You talk to him a lot these days?" She replied, "He is my manager, Ethan. Stop overthinking." I said, "Sometimes it feels like more than work." She stood up and said sharply, "That is not fair." I lowered my eyes. "I am just saying how I feel." She sighed and said, "You are insecure lately." That word hit me hard. I said, "Maybe I am insecure because you are never home." She didn't answer for a moment. Then she said, "I am building our future." I whispered, "Or building a life away from me." She froze. "What did you say?" I quickly said, "Nothing. Forget it." She grabbed her coat and said, "I have another call. I need to go back to work." I watched her leave again. The door closed, and silence came back like a heavy wall. I sat alone at the table and said quietly, "Something is changing, and I don't know what." But deep inside, I already felt it. My marriage was no longer safe. Something invisible had already started breaking between us. I picked up my phone and called Ryan. Ryan answered fast and said, "Hey Ethan, what is wrong?" I said, "I think something is happening with Victoria." Ryan said, "Did she do something again?" I said, "I don't know, but everything feels different." Ryan said, "Bro, you need to watch her closely." I said, "I already feel like I am losing her." Ryan said, "Don't think like that, gather proof first." I said, "I just want the truth even if it hurts." Ryan said, "Truth always comes, but you must be ready." I looked at the empty room and said, "I already feel broken inside." Ryan said, "Stay strong, Ethan, don't lose yourself." I whispered, "I don't know if I can stay strong anymore." I ended the call and sat back in silence. My phone lit up with a message from Victoria. The message said, "I will be late again, don't wait up." I stared at it and felt my chest tighten. I said softly out loud, "So it is happening." I stood up and walked to the window. I looked outside and said, "I cannot lose her like this." I closed my eyes and said, "I need to know the truth now." And in that moment I decided I would not stay silent anymore. I told myself tomorrow I will follow her to the office. I said, "I need proof, not just fear." I walked back to the table and sat down again. The silence felt heavier than before. I said quietly, "Victoria, I hope I am wrong about you." But deep inside I knew I was not wrong. I turned off the lights and said, "Tomorrow everything changes." I lay down and whispered, "I will find the truth no matter what." Sleep did not come easily that night, and I knew my life was already changing forever. I kept thinking about Victoria and Daniel all night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. I whispered, "I gave you everything, why are you doing this?" I said, "I will not break, I will understand the truth." The night felt endless and heavy. I finally closed my eyes and said, "I am ready for tomorrow." I woke up before sunrise and said, "Today I will follow her." I stood in front of the mirror and said, "I am not the same man anymore." I picked up my coat and said, "Victoria, I am coming for the truth." I left the house and whispered, "Everything is about to change." The morning air felt cold and heavy on my skin. I said quietly, "I will not be fooled again." I walked forward and said, "This is only the beginning. I know today I will uncover everything about Victoria and Daniel, no matter what happens next in my life now forever." Days passed slowly, and I could feel Victoria drifting farther away from me each day. She came home late almost every night, and when she did, her eyes looked like she was somewhere else entirely. I asked her one evening, "Do you even know what time it is anymore?" She didn't even look at me properly. "I am building something important, Ethan. You should understand that." I said, "I do understand, but I also miss you." She sighed. "You always make everything emotional." That hurt more than I wanted to admit. One evening, I made a decision I could not take back. I told myself, I will go to her office. I will just see how she is working. I didn't tell her. I just went. When I reached the building, the guard James looked at me and said, "Sir, you are here late." I nodded and said, "Just visiting Victoria." He let me in without question. Inside, the building felt too quiet, too clean, too cold. I walked slowly toward her office. Then I stopped. I saw the door slightly open. I heard laughter inside. I pushed it just enough to see. Victoria was there, and Daniel Scott was with her. They were sitting too close, too comfortable. Daniel smiled and said, "You are too stressed, you need to relax." Victoria replied softly, "Work never stops." Then I saw him take a piece of chocolate and feed it to her. She didn't stop him. She even smiled. My chest tightened instantly. I whispered, "No, this cannot be real." Daniel said, "You always act like you are alone in this." Victoria laughed softly. "Maybe I am." I stepped back quickly before they could see me. My heart was beating so fast I thought it would break my ribs. I turned around and walked away without looking back. Outside the building, I stood under the streetlight and tried to breathe. I said to myself, I saw nothing. It must mean nothing. But my voice didn't believe my own words. On the way home, I kept gripping the steering wheel too tightly. I kept repeating, "It is just work, just work." But my hands were shaking. When I reached home, I acted normal. Victoria wasn't there yet. I cooked something I couldn't eat. I sat at the table and stared at my plate. I whispered, "Why did I see that?" When she finally came home later that night, I smiled like nothing happened. She said, "You are still awake?" I said, "Couldn't sleep." She kissed my forehead lightly. "You should rest more." I nodded but said nothing else. Inside, I felt like I was falling apart silently. That night I called Ryan Cole. He picked up and said, "Ethan, what happened? You sound off." I hesitated and said, "I saw Victoria with Daniel." Ryan paused. "Where?" I said, "Her office." They were too close. Ryan said, "Did you talk to her?" I said, "No. I just watched." Ryan's voice turned serious. "Ethan, something is not right. You need proof before you break yourself." I said quietly, "What if the proof already broke me?" Ryan said, "Don't jump to conclusions." But I already was. For the first time, I started thinking maybe my marriage was not what I thought it was. And that thought scared me more than anything in my life. After the call ended, I stayed sitting in silence for a long time. My phone was still in my hand, but I didn't even move. I kept replaying everything in my head. The laughter, the chocolate, the way Victoria didn't pull away. I said out loud, "Why didn't you stop him?" The room didn't answer me. Later that night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that office again. I whispered, "Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe it was nothing." But my heart answered back, "You know it was something." The next morning, Victoria was already getting ready for work. She looked at me and said, "You were quiet today." I forced a small smile. "Just tired." She said, "You should stop overthinking things. It is not good for you." I nodded and said, "Maybe you are right." But inside, I felt far from her already. After she left, I called Ryan again. He said, "Ethan, did you think more about it?" I said, "I can't get it out of my head." Ryan replied, "Then you need to watch everything closely now. No emotions. Just facts." I said, "I don't know if I can do that." Ryan said, "You have to. Otherwise you will lose yourself." I looked at the empty house and said quietly, "Maybe I already lost her." Ryan said, "Don't say that yet. Just be careful." I ended the call and sat near the window for a long time. I said to myself, if this is the truth, I need to be ready for it. My hands slowly stopped shaking, but my mind didn't. I made a decision that I would go back to her office again soon. I whispered, "Next time, I won't just watch from far away." And for the first time, I felt something change inside me. I will find the truth no matter what now. I called Ryan first thing in the morning. "Ryan, I need you again," I said. He replied, "You still thinking about Victoria?" I said, "I can't stop thinking about what I saw." Ryan said, "Then we do this carefully." I nodded even though he couldn't see me. We started watching her office from a distance. I parked across the street most evenings. Ryan sat with me sometimes, drinking cheap coffee. He said, "You are not sleeping, Ethan." I said, "Sleep feels useless now." One afternoon, I saw Sophie Lane outside the building. She looked at me and said, "You are Victoria's husband, right?" I said, "Yes." She hesitated and said, "You should be careful. Not everything you see is simple." I asked, "What does that mean?" She looked away and said, "Just be careful with Daniel." Her words stayed in my head all day. I said to myself, why is everyone warning me but no one explaining anything? Days later, I stayed later than usual. That is when I saw Victoria and Daniel leaving together. He leaned close and said something to her. She smiled faintly. Then he touched her hand. She didn't pull away. My chest felt like it cracked. I whispered, "Why didn't you stop him?" I drove home in silence. Ryan called and said, "Did you see anything?" I said, "I saw enough." He said, "That is not proof yet." I said, "It feels like proof in my chest." At home, I couldn't sleep. I opened a notebook and started writing everything. I said out loud, "If I don't write this down, I will lose my mind." I wrote every detail I remembered. The chocolate, the office, the smile, the touch. I said, maybe I am going crazy. Then I said, or maybe I am finally seeing clearly. Ryan called me later that night and said, "Ethan, you need to calm down." I said, "I am calm. I just need answers." Ryan said, "Answers come with time, not pressure." I said, "Time is what is breaking me." He said, "Then we move faster carefully." The next morning, I went back to the office building again. I told myself I will not react. I will only observe. Sophie saw me again and said, "You are here too often." I said, "I just need to understand." She said, "Understanding can hurt more than ignorance." I said, "I am already hurting." She looked at me and said, "Then be ready for more truth." That evening, I waited outside again. Ryan joined me and said, "You are becoming obsessed." I said, "I am becoming honest." Ryan said, "Honesty without balance destroys people." I said, "Then let it destroy the lies." He stayed quiet for a moment and said, "Just be careful, Ethan." Later, I saw Victoria through the glass window. She was laughing with Daniel again. I felt that same crack in my chest. Ryan said, "Don't look too long." I said, "I already did." Sophie walked past me and dropped a small note without looking at me. I whispered, "What is this?" Ryan said, "Open it later, not here." I nodded slowly. My hands were shaking again. I said, "Everything feels like it is slipping away." That night I couldn't sleep again. I kept thinking about Sophie's warning and Victoria's smile. I said to myself, nothing is simple anymore. Ryan called and said, "We might have something soon." I said, "What kind of something?" He said, "Evidence. Real evidence." I closed my eyes and said, "I am ready for anything now." The next day I returned again. Sophie saw me and said, You really can't stop this, can you? I said, I need truth, not peace. She said, truth will not give you peace either. I said, I am past peace now. That afternoon I saw Daniel and Victoria again leaving together. He held the door for her like he owned her. Ryan whispered, don't go there. I said, I already am. I followed them from a distance, my heart beating fast. Sophie texted me, stop before you break yourself. I replied, I already am broken. I saw them stop near the parking area. Daniel said something and Victoria laughed again. I whispered, this is not love anymore. Ryan came and pulled me back. We are done watching today, he said. I said, no, I need to know everything. Sophie finally stood in front of me and said, Ethan, I warned you. Nothing good comes from this path. I said, then I will face whatever comes. I stood there watching them disappear into the building again. Ryan said, Ethan, come on, let it go. I said, I cannot let it go anymore. Sophie walked away slowly but said, the truth always comes at a cost. I whispered, I will pay whatever it takes. I looked at the building one last time and said, I am not the same man anymore. I whispered, I will face the truth no matter what happens next now. Victoria told me we had a company event that night. She said, you are coming with me, Ethan. It will look good for the media. I nodded and said, if you want me there, I will come. We entered the hall together. Lights were bright, music soft, people smiling like nothing in the world was broken. Victoria held my arm for the cameras. She whispered, just smile and stay close. I said, I always stay close. You are the one who moves away. She didn't reply. Inside the hall, I saw many executives and staff. Everyone looked polished, powerful, untouchable. I felt like I didn't belong there anymore. Then Victoria introduced me to a woman near the stage. She said, Ethan, this is Olivia Harris. She is an important business partner. Olivia looked at me and smiled slowly. Her eyes were sharp, like she was reading something inside me. She said, so you are Ethan? I said, yes. Nice to meet you. She tilted her head and said, is it really nice though? I frowned. What do you mean? Victoria interrupted quickly. Olivia, don't start. Olivia raised her hands slightly and said, relax, I am just observing. I felt something strange in her tone, like she already knew something about me. Later, Victoria got pulled into meetings and interviews. I stood near the drinks table alone. Olivia walked toward me slowly. She said, you look like a man who has questions. I said, I don't know you well enough to answer that. She smiled. But I know your situation well enough. I turned toward her. My situation? She leaned closer and said, your wife is not who you think she is. I froze. Excuse me? She said, we should talk somewhere private. I said, I don't talk to strangers about my wife. She replied, then keep living in confusion. Something in her voice pulled me. I didn't trust her, but I couldn't ignore her either. I followed her to a quiet balcony outside the hall. The night air was cold. She leaned on the railing and said, you love her, don't you? I said, that is not your business. She nodded. Love makes people blind. I said, what are you trying to say? She looked at me directly. Daniel Scott. My body stiffened. What about him? She said, you really think he is just a manager? I said, that is what Victoria told me. Olivia laughed softly. Of course she did. I said sharply, if you are going to accuse her, give me proof. She opened her purse slowly. She pulled out her phone. She said, I don't speak without reason. She showed me pictures. My hands started shaking instantly. It was Victoria and Daniel. Too close. Too familiar. Sitting together, laughing, touching hands in ways that didn't feel professional at all. I whispered, no, this is not real. Olivia said, look at it properly. I said, these can be edited. She said, all of them. She swiped again. More photos. Same two people. different places. Same intimacy. My throat went dry. I said, "Why are you showing me this?" She said, "Because you deserve the truth." I stepped back. "I don't know you. Why would I trust you?" She said calmly, "You don't have to trust me. Just trust what you see." I felt anger rising inside me. I said, "What do you want from this?" She closed her phone and said, "I want her exposed." I frowned. "Why?" She said, "Because Victoria Blake destroyed my company once. Now I will destroy hers." I shook my head. "So this is revenge for you," she said. "Call it what you want. But you are also suffering, aren't you?" I stayed silent. She stepped closer. "I can help you destroy them." I said quickly, "No." She smiled slightly. "You are refusing before thinking." I said, "I am not part of your revenge." She said, "Then you will stay part of their lie." That hit me harder than I expected. I turned away and said, "I need time." She said, "Take it, but don't wait too long." I walked back inside the hall feeling heavy. Victoria came toward me and said, "Where were you?" I said, "Just outside." She looked at me carefully. "You look different." I forced a smile. "I am fine." She said, "Don't overthink tonight. Just enjoy it." I nodded but couldn't hear her properly anymore. Olivia's words kept repeating in my head. "Your wife is not who you think she is." That night at home, Victoria slept early. I sat alone in the dark living room. My hands were still shaking slightly. I whispered, "What did I just see?" I opened my phone and looked at the photos again in my memory. I said, "If this is true, everything changes." I felt something breaking inside me again. Not sadness this time. Something heavier. Anger. I said quietly, "Why her? Why Daniel?" Then I remembered Olivia's voice again. "I can help you destroy them." I closed my eyes and said, "Am I becoming someone I don't recognize?" I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the city was silent. Inside me, nothing was silent anymore. I whispered, "If this is the truth, I need to know everything." And for the first time, I didn't just feel pain. I felt the beginning of revenge growing inside me. I called Henry Adams after many years. My hands were still not steady when I dialed his number. He picked up and said, "Ethan? Is that really you?" I said, "Yes, it's me. I need to see you." He paused and said, "Your voice sounds heavy. Come to my place." When I arrived, he looked older but still calm. He said, "Sit down. Tell me everything." I said, "My marriage is falling apart." He didn't interrupt. He just listened. I said, "Victoria is hiding something. I saw things I can't explain." Henry said, "Start from the beginning. Don't rush." So I told him everything. Daniel, the office, Olivia, the photos, everything I had seen. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment. Henry leaned back and said, "Pain makes men blind. Use it to see clearly." I said, "I am trying, but I feel like I am losing control." He said, "Control is not what you need. Clarity is." I asked, "How do I get clarity when everything feels like a lie?" He replied, "You stop reacting. You start observing." I frowned. "I am already watching her." He shook his head. "Watching is emotional. Observing is empty." I said, "I don't understand." He stood up and said, "When you see her with Daniel, what do you feel?" I said, "Anger, pain, confusion." He said, "That is your problem. Your emotions are leading you." I stayed quiet. He said, "If you want truth, you must stop breaking every time you see something." I said, "Then what should I do?" He looked at me and said, "Learn patience. Let them reveal themselves." Those words stayed in my head. Later, I met Michael Grant in a small cafe downtown. He said, "Henry told me about your situation." I said, "I need to understand what I can do legally." He said, "Before that, tell me what you actually know." So I explained everything again. Victoria, Daniel, Olivia, the suspicion. Michael listened carefully and said, "Do you have proof?" I said, "Not solid proof. Just what I saw. He said, then you are in a dangerous stage. Assumptions can destroy you faster than truth. I said, I am not trying to assume. I am trying to survive. He nodded slowly. Then you need documentation, evidence, dates, records. I said, I have started writing things down. He said, good. Keep doing that. But don't confront yet. I said, I don't plan to confront anyone yet. But inside I wasn't fully sure. After that meeting, I started meeting Sophie Lane more often. She called me one evening and said, we need to talk. I met her near a quiet park. She looked nervous. I said, why are you helping me? She said, I am not helping you. I am just tired of seeing things ignored. I said, what things? She said, Daniel's meetings are not normal. I asked, what do you mean? She said, he meets investors alone at night. Secret meetings. Not recorded in official schedules. I said, Victoria allows that? She said quietly, she trusts him too much. I felt my chest tighten again. I said, why are you telling me this now? She looked away. Because you deserve to know something is wrong. She handed me a small note again. I said, what is this? She said, times, locations. That is all I can give you. I said, you are risking a lot. She said, so are you. After she left, I opened the note inside my car. It had dates, late-night meetings, hidden locations. My hands tightened around the paper. I whispered, this is getting deeper than I thought. I called Ryan immediately. He said, what now? I said, Sophie gave me something. Real patterns. Ryan said, so it's not just your imagination anymore. I said, no, it's real. He said, Ethan, be careful. This can spiral fast. I said, I already feel like I am in too deep. That night I sat alone and connected all the pieces. Olivia's photos, Sophie's notes, Daniel's behavior, Victoria's distance. I said quietly, this is not just cheating. Something bigger is happening. My phone rang. It was Michael. He said, start organizing everything. We may need a case soon. I said, a case against who? He said, whoever is hiding the truth. After the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time. I looked at the ceiling and whispered, Victoria, what are you really doing? For the first time, I wasn't just hurt. I was analyzing. I was watching patterns. I was learning control. And I could feel something shifting inside me. Pain was no longer leading me. Something colder was beginning to take its place. James Parker met me behind the building like we planned. He looked around and said, you sure you want to do this, Ethan? I said, I need answers, James, not guesses. He sighed. If anyone finds out, I lose my job. I said, I won't tell anyone. I just need access for a few minutes. He hesitated, then nodded. All right, come with me. We walked through the side corridor into the security room. The screens were blinking with live feeds. James said, I shouldn't even be showing you this. I replied, then don't think. Just help me once. He typed on the system and said, which day? I said, the night I saw them together. He searched slowly and said, this is recorded, but not everyone is supposed to see it. My heart started beating faster. Just play it. He looked at me once. Ethan, I warned you. I said, just play it. He clicked the file. The screen flickered, and then I saw her. Victoria. Daniel was with her in the office. My hands slowly clenched. James whispered, Ethan, maybe you should stop watching. I said, no, keep it going. On the screen, they were laughing. Daniel leaned closer. He took chocolate from a small box on the desk. He fed it to her. I froze instantly. James said, Ethan. I didn't respond. Then Daniel moved closer again. He kissed her. Everything inside me stopped. The room felt silent even though I could still hear the monitor buzzing. James said softly, I'm sorry. I couldn't move. I kept staring at the screen like my body forgot how to react. Victoria didn't pull away. She didn't stop him. She didn't even look shocked. My throat went dry. I whispered, "So it's true." James said, "Ethan, turn it off." I shook my head slightly. "No, I need to see it clearly." He said, "You've seen enough." But I kept watching. They sat together again like nothing happened. Daniel smiled. Victoria smiled back. Felt like something broke inside my chest. Not loudly, quietly, like glass cracking under pressure. James said, "Ethan, please." I raised my hand slightly. "Just one more minute." But I already knew everything. I stepped back from the screen. My breathing slowed strangely. James said, "Talk to me." I didn't answer. I walked slowly toward the wall. I leaned against it and stared at the floor. James said, "Say something." I finally spoke. I said, "Now I see you." My voice was calm. Too calm. James looked uncomfortable. "Ethan, don't do anything stupid." I said, "I am not doing anything." But inside, something had already changed forever. I left the security room without looking back. The hallway felt longer than before. My steps were slow, controlled. No shaking. No panic. Just silence inside my head. Outside, the night air hit my face. I stood still for a moment. I said quietly, "So this is what it is." I took my phone out and looked at nothing for a while. Then I called Ryan. He answered quickly. "Ethan? What happened?" I said, "I saw it." Ryan went quiet. "Saw what?" I said, "Everything." He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yes." My voice didn't shake. Ryan said softly, "I am sorry." I said, "Don't be sorry. Just listen." He said, "Where are you now?" I said, "Outside the office." He said, "Come home. Don't do anything tonight." I said, "I am not doing anything." But I didn't move. After the call, I stayed standing in the dark. I looked at the building and said, "You really did this." My hands were calm now, strangely calm. Inside me, something had ended. I remembered every moment again. The chocolate, the kiss, her silence. I said, "I loved you, and you were already gone." A strange emptiness filled my chest. No tears came. No anger exploded. Just silence. I walked slowly to my car. James followed and said, "Ethan, go home." I said, "I will." But I didn't feel like the same person who came here. On the drive back, everything looked different. The roads, the lights, even my own reflection in the mirror. I whispered, "I am not him anymore." When I reached home, I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the dark living room, phone in my hand. Victoria wasn't home yet. I said quietly, "This is the breaking point." And somewhere inside me, something old died completely. But something new opened its eyes for the first time. Cold, focused, silent, and ready. I stopped going home early after that night. I couldn't sit in that house and pretend anymore. So I stayed out longer, driving through empty streets, letting silence sit beside me like a second shadow. Ryan called me one evening and said, "You can't keep disappearing like this, Ethan." I said, "I am not disappearing. I am just changing." He replied, "That sounds dangerous." I said, "Maybe it is." Henry met me again a few days later. He looked at me carefully and said, "You look different now." I said, "I feel different too." He nodded slowly. "Good. Now you are starting to see without emotion." I said, "It doesn't feel good. It feels empty." Henry said, "Empty is where clarity begins." I didn't answer that. Instead, I said, "What do I do next?" He replied, "You wait, and you learn." Meanwhile, Michael called me with updates about legal structures and company records. He said, "Ethan, if you are serious, we can open a proper case." I said, "I am serious, but I want truth, not noise." Michael said, "Truth always creates noise." I said, "Then I am ready for it." That same week, Olivia Harris contacted me again. She said over the phone, "Have you decided yet?" I said, Decided what? She replied. To stop pretending you are not at war. I stayed silent. She said, I have more than photos now. I have financial links, internal leaks, everything. I said, why are you helping me? She said, because Victoria doesn't deserve power. I said, I don't want your revenge. She laughed lightly. Call it whatever you want. But you are already in it. I said, I am only interested in truth. She said, truth and revenge look the same when you are standing in fire. Then she said, meet me tomorrow. I didn't answer immediately, but I eventually said, fine. One meeting. After the call, I sat with Ryan in my car. He said, you are actually considering her offer? I said, I am considering information, not her. Ryan said, that woman is dangerous. I said, so is ignorance. Ryan looked at me and said, you are not the same anymore. I said, I know. Later that night, Sophie Lane called me secretly. She said, Daniel is moving faster than you think. I said, what do you mean? She said, he is meeting investors behind Victoria's back. He is building something separate. I said, does she know? Sophie said quietly, I don't think so. I clenched my jaw. So he is planning something big. She replied, yes, and Victoria is too blind to see it. I asked, why are you telling me this? She said, because you are the only one paying attention. After the call ended, I sat in silence again. Everything was connecting now. Daniel wasn't just close to Victoria. He was building power beside her, or against her. The next day, I met Olivia in a quiet cafe. She didn't waste time. She slid a folder toward me. She said, read it. I opened it slowly. Inside were company records, bank transfers, hidden meetings. I said, this is illegal to even have. She said, so is what they are doing. I looked at her. You collected all this? She said, over time, patiently. I said, what do you want from me? She leaned forward. I want you to stop being the ignored husband and start being the reason she loses everything. I closed the folder. I said, I told you, I don't want revenge. She smiled slightly. Then call it justice. I stood up. I will decide what it is. She said calmly, just don't take too long. Daniel is already moving pieces. I left the cafe feeling heavier than before. At night, Ryan asked me, what did she show you? I said, enough to know this is bigger than betrayal. Ryan said, Ethan, you are getting pulled into something you don't fully understand. I said, I understand enough to know I can't walk away now. He said quietly, and Victoria? I paused. Then I said, she still doesn't know anything. Ryan said, that might change everything. I said, it already has. Later, I met Henry again. He said, you are standing at the edge now. I said, I already fell off a long time ago. He looked at me and said, then build yourself back differently. I said, I am not rebuilding. I am transforming. He nodded. Good. Because the old you would not survive this. That night, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. I barely recognized the man staring back. I whispered, I am no longer the man she ignored. And for the first time, that didn't feel like pain. Felt like power. I arrived at the company building with Michael and Olivia beside me. My hands were calm, but my mind was not. Today was the day everything would end or begin again. Michael said quietly, you ready for this? I said, I have been ready since the day I saw the truth. Olivia looked at me and said, once you walk in, there is no going back. I replied, I am already past the point of going back. We entered the meeting hall. Victoria stood at the front, confident, smiling like nothing in her world could break. Daniel stood beside her, relaxed, like he owned the room. Victoria saw me and froze for half a second. She said, Ethan, what are you doing here? I walked forward slowly. I said, I came to show the truth. Daniel laughed lightly. This is dramatic. Michael stepped forward and said, Let him speak. Olivia added. You might want to sit down, Victoria. Victoria frowned. What is going on? I looked at everyone in the room and said, before you decide who I am, watch this. I connected my device to the screen. The first video appeared. It showed Daniel and Victoria together in the office. Murmurs filled the room. Victoria said sharply, turn that off. I said, no. You turned me off for too long. Daniel said, this is edited nonsense. Olivia said calmly, all footage is verified. I switched clips. Photos appeared next. Bank records followed. Messages filled the screen. The room went silent. Someone whispered, is this real? I said, every piece is real. Victoria stepped forward and said, Ethan, I can explain everything. I looked at her and said, you had years to explain. She said, it is not what you think. I replied, that is exactly what I thought once. Not anymore. Daniel said angrily, you are destroying everything. I said, no, you did. Michael spoke clearly. This is now a legal matter. Olivia said, and a corporate one. Victoria looked at Daniel. Tell me this is not happening. Daniel stayed silent. That silence said everything. Victoria whispered, you planned this, both of you? I said, no. You planned this life without me in it. Her eyes filled with shock. She said softly, Ethan, please. I said, I loved you blindly. That was my mistake. The room stayed frozen. I stepped closer and said, I am not here to scream, I am here to end this chapter. Victoria shook her head. We can fix this. I replied, some things are not fixable. Daniel tried to speak, but Michael stopped him. Olivia said, your company is already under investigation. Victoria looked lost for the first time. She said, everything I built. I said, you built it with someone else while I stood in your shadow. Silence filled the hall again. I took a breath and said, I am done. Victoria said, Ethan, wait. I shook my head. I said, there is nothing left to wait for. I turned slightly and looked at her one last time. I said, goodbye, Victoria. She whispered, don't do this. But I already walked away. Michael followed me. Olivia stayed behind for a moment and said, it is finished. As I reached the exit, I heard Victoria call my name again. But I did not turn back. Outside, the air felt different. Michael said, you are going to be okay? I said, no, but I am free. Olivia said, freedom hurts first. I replied, I know. We stood there in silence. Michael looked at me and said, this is not over for them. I said, it is over for me. Olivia said, you think ending something makes it gone? I said, it makes me free. Michael said, freedom without consequences is rare. I looked at the building behind us and said, I already paid the price. Olivia stepped closer and said, then use that price wisely. I said, I will not become like them. Michael said, that is the only way you win. I nodded slowly and said, then I will win my own way. Olivia said, and what about Victoria? I stayed silent for a moment and said, she lost me before this even began. Michael said, do you want her back? I shook my head and said, no, I want my life back. Olivia nodded and said, then it is done. I took one last look at the hall behind us and whispered, goodbye to everything I thought I knew. Michael said, go home, Ethan, live what you have left. I looked at both of them and said, I am not lost anymore. Olivia smiled faintly and said, then you are finally free. I turned away from them and walked forward into the unknown future. I am finally free.